Good morning. Yes, Ms Ward.
Good morning, Your Honour. Your Honour might recall yesterday afternoon Mr Newton indicated that today there would be a different appearance.
Ms Woodland.
Ms Woodland is on mute.
Sorry, Your Honour.
That's okay.
I appear for the Commissioner of the Royal Fire Service, National Parks and Wildlife Service and the Forestry Corporation of New South Wales.
Thank you. And we have Ms Wilkinson and Ms Ansom as well.
Yes, Your Honour. Your Honour, the first witness today in the bushfire inquiry into the Falford Road Darawang fire is Mr Paul Demar.
Mr Demar, can you see and hear us in the courtroom?
Yeah, yes, I can.
All right, you'll just hear from the court officer now. Thank you.
Silence, please. Do you solemnly and sincerely declare and affirm that the evidence you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please say, I do.
I do.
Thank you. Yes, Ms Ward.
Thank you, Your Honour. Would you state your full name and professional address?
My name is Paul James DeMar. My professional address is 15/133 Castlereagh Street, Sydney.
Are you a private consultant in the fields of land, vegetation and bushfire risk management?
Yes, I am.
Do you have particular expertise in relation to vegetation management and bushfire mitigation strategy for electricity network service providers?
Yes, I do.
Were you retained by the Department of Communities and Justice to provide a report about vegetation management and vegetation impact upon some conductors at Falford Road, Darawang?
Yes, I was.
Do you have a copy of that? Did that result in an expert report from the 11th of February of this year, Mr Demar?
Yes.
Do you have a copy of that report with you?
I do.
Could I firstly ask you to just turn up page 2-9, which is page 6, using the numbering within your report?
Yes, I'm on page 6 now.
And do you see that there is a footnote at the bottom of that page dealing with the prevailing wind coming from the west-northwest?
Yes.
Is there a correction you wish to make to that footnote or the detail contained therein?
Yes, there is.
What correction would you like to make?
What I meant to articulate in that sentence is that the wind speed on the floor of a forest will be around 1/3 of the wind speed measured in the open, as is done by the Met Bureau's instruments. And put another way, the wind speed at 10 metres is typically three times the wind speed that's apparent, at 1.5 metres within a forest.
I'll ask you some questions about the prevailing wind strength and direction later in your evidence. But before I do so, having made that correction, are the opinions you express within your report otherwise, do you maintain those opinions otherwise?
Yes, I do.
Mr Demar, I'm going to ask you some questions this morning, obviously focused around a particular tree that lost a branch or branches at Falford Road. And I'm just going to refer to that tree as the subject tree for the purpose of the questions this morning. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Did you look at a range of photographs from the scene of ignition for the Falford Road Darawang fire and also examine the scene for yourself?
Yes, I did, both of those things.
As a result of those steps, have you formed the conclusion that two branches likely fell from the subject tree onto conductors in the lead up to the fire?
Yes, I have.
I'm now going to ask some questions that are focused on the stubs of the fractured branches that remained evident in the subject tree on your review. Firstly, I'm going to have the photo at page 2-10 of the brief brought up on the screen. And this is taken from your report, Mr. Demar. We'll just wait for that to come up onto the screen. Can you see that photo there?
Yes, I can.
It's photo marked figure 1 in your report, if it assists you to look at it directly in your report. You didn't take this photo, but they're your markings in red at the top of the photo. Is that right to say?
That's correct.
Was the photo taken by one of the New South Wales police officers who investigated the cause and origin of the fire?
I believe so.
And do you believe it was taken the day after the fire ignited on Falford Road?
I believe so.
Did you identify within this photo, well, you seem to have identified within this photo the 2 fractured branch stubs, suggesting that 2 separate branches fell from the subject tree. Is that right?
Yes, I've identified those and I've indicated them using arrows in my report.
Were the 2 fractured branch stubs obvious to you solely from your review of the photographs, or did you need to also attend the scene to confirm for yourself that there were indeed separate branch stubs within the subject tree?
Look, it was reasonably clear that 2 branches had broken from the photographs, but I used my site visit to really confirm that.
Just looking at this photo, it seems that fractured branch stub 1 was lower, closer to the ground than fractured branch stub 2. Is that something you were then able to confirm by measurements taken at the scene?
Yes, it was.
Can you tell Her Honour the estimated height of the fractured branch stub 1 from the ground?
Yes, I can. It's in my report.
I think in your report, I can't find the precise reference at the moment, but I think you suggested it's 11.5 metres from the ground. Oh yes, paragraph 24.
That's right, and the other branch stub is higher, up at about 15 metres above the ground.
And each stub was higher than the conductors that are evident in this photo and were there when you visited the scene, is that right?
Yes, the stubs were both considerably higher than the lines, and then of course those branches branched in an upwards and outwards direction, so the higher parts of the branches, when they were in situ, would have been even higher above the conductors.
You measured the conductors as being about 7 metres from the ground, is that right?
Approximately. It was more difficult to measure the height of the conductors because I used an inclinometer to measure the height of the branches, but I'm not able to use an inclinometer to measure the height of the conductors, so that's just an estimate.
And is there a catenary, I think the word is, in the span between the 2 poles? In other words, did the conductors sag, or are they held taut between the 2 poles?
No, they're not taut. There is definitely a sag in the span, and that's common power line spans.
Thank you. I'm now going to take you to a photograph and ask you some questions related to the fallen branches that you identified at the scene. The photograph at 2-16 of the report is now going to come up, and Mr. Demar, this is figure 7 using the numbers of your report. Can you see that photograph on the screen?
Yes, I can.
Is this once again a photograph taken by New South Wales Police, but which you have considered and marked up with those details setting out a smaller branch and a larger branch?
Yes, and earlier than the figure 1 that we just saw, because this one, the branches are still caught up on the power lines. So this is before Essential Energy have done any clearing of the lines and restoration of the service.
And were you able, I'll withdraw that, how were you able to determine from this photograph that we're in fact dealing with two separate branches rather than, for instance, one larger branch that is broken into two separate pieces?
You can see where I've indicated the locations of what I consider are the two branches. I looked at the size of those branches in relation to the sizes of the branch stubs in the subject tree.
Yes.
And from that, I've determined that the large branch there was from branch stub 1, and that the smaller branch that I've indicated is consistent with the size of the stub that I've indicated as stub 2.
Just looking at the smaller branch that you've identified in this photo, it appears to be almost vertical. Am I looking at the right branch?
Yes, that's correct.
The court understands from a witness at the scene who was driving along the road when a branch fell that he ended up driving over the end of it and it broke into smaller pieces, which he then flicked off the road. That means, doesn't it, that there's no way of establishing the precise length of the branch that he drove over?
I would agree with that.
It's no criticism of someone who almost had a branch land on them and then had to respond to a fire emergency, but that's just the simple fact arising from one way in which the scene was treated after the fire ignited. Would you agree with that broad proposition?
Yes, I would.
Okay. Moving then to your conclusions as to which of the two branches detached from which of the two stubs, did you ultimately conclude that the larger of the two branches came from the stub that you had identified as stub 1?
Yes, I did.
And that was the lower of the two stubs in the subject tree, wasn't it?
Yes.
Therefore, the smaller of the two branches, you conclude, came from stub 2, the higher stub in the tree?
Correct.
And could you explain to the court how you came to that conclusion?
Principally, the size of the branches, they're different in size. The lower branch is a structural branch, so it's a large limb, whereas the smaller second branch from stub 2 is actually a separate branch coming out from a larger branch. So they're quite different in size, and that size enables me to identify which stub each of them came from.
When you say different in size, are you referring to both the length but also the diameter?
It's mainly the diameter that I'm relying on for that conclusion.
Very well. And did you also observe some differences in terms of borer or termite damage between the two branches?
Yes, so in branch 1, the larger of the two branches, in photos that I've included in the report there, there is evidence of termite workings within the branch, whereas in the branch 2, where it is broken away, there is no evidence of, I can't see any evidence of any termite workings within the branch.
All right, we'll come to those photographs in a moment, Mr. Demar, but next I'm going to have the photo that's contained at tab 2-20 of the brief brought up on screen. This is figure 11 using your numbering.
Yes.
Now, can you see that? Is that tolerably clear for you on the screen?
Yes, it is.
Very well. Could you explain to the court what this picture is and how it's relevant to your investigation into the fall of the branches from the subject tree?
Right. Well, this picture is obtained from Google Street View. So I accessed the Google Maps application, located the subject tree, and then within the Google Street View you can pan and you can zoom, and so I've panned up to have a look at the location within the subject tree where the two broken branches were located. Now, as you can see in that figure 11, down in the bottom right-hand corner, it indicates that that image was captured by Google in May 2018. So this is an image of the tree well before the fire and before these branches broke away from the tree. And so I could see the two branches still in situ within the tree that have subsequently broken away during this incident. And so by zooming in, I've been able to trace, if you like, the location and direction of extension of those two branches within the tree to try and assist the court to understand how those branches would have been arranged within the tree crown prior to their failure.
Branch 1 you've marked in yellow, and that's on the left-hand side, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
That's the bigger of the branches that fell onto the conductors, in your view?
Yes, it is.
Branch 2 is then the branch that you've marked in white on the right.
That's correct.
Does this photo suggest that branch 1 was the longer of the two branches, even when the branches were in situ?
Yes, it does.
What this photo does is demonstrate the location and reach of the branches within that tree as at May 2018. It doesn't necessarily tell us what that tree might have looked like immediately prior to the fire or to the failures that caused the fire, which happened over 12 months later.
No, look, that's right. We'll never know exactly what that tree looked like just prior to the branches failing and the fire. We have there's no source for us to know that, and this is the best available information we have to try and get some insight into the reach of those branches and the location of those branches prior to them failing.
Thank you. Mr. Demar, could I ask you please to turn up page 2-15 of your report, and I'm just going to ask you some questions about your hypotheses as to how the branches came to fall, set out in paragraph 30.
Okay, paragraph 30 of my report.
Yes, thank you. Tell me if this is a fair summary. Is it your opinion that the larger branch coming from the lower stub within the subject tree fell and then collided forcefully with the smaller branch coming from the higher stub within the tree, causing it to fracture and fall?
Yes, that's what I think is likely to have happened.
Can you explain to the court how it is that the branch from a lower stub was able to impact upon a branch growing out of a higher stub within the tree?
Yes, I can. So in the image that we looked at just earlier, I showed that whilst the branch 1, which is the larger of the two branches, started from lower in the tree than branch 2, it also extended higher within the tree. So it was a longer branch and it extended higher within the crown than branch 1, or certainly at least as high. And so when it broke, because it was longer and reached up to at least the same level as branch 1, it's therefore able to contact branch 1 if it falls, even though it's initiating lower within the stem of the tree.
I mean, it seems obvious, but the location of the stubs within the subject tree don't define the reach of the branches that grew out from the stubs.
Absolutely. In my opinion, branch 1, it was a structural branch. It was a much larger branch and longer. So it was able to reach up to a similar level or potentially even higher than branch 2, which was a smaller branch, but commenced its branch union was much higher in the tree.
I'm going to have another of the photos that you've marked up brought up on the screen now. This is taken from page 2-21 of the brief, and it's your figure 12. Can you see that, Mr. Damar?
Yes, I can.
Is this another image that you were able to take from Google Street View?
Yes, it is. So the earlier image was fairly square on
Yes.
with the subject tree, whereas this image I've moved along the road further to the east and looked back towards the tree so that I can show the subject branches from a different angle.
This is still taken from Google Street View imaging of May 2018, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And you can see that in that image, the branch 1, when I was referring before to that branch extending higher than branch 2, this image shows that with the yellow reaching up at least as high or higher than branch 1 in that image.
Did this image and the other photographs or the other aspects that you have looked at from the Google Street View imaging allow you to form an opinion as to the general direction in which branch 1 was growing?
Yes, it did.
What was that opinion?
That opinion is that it's growing out into the clear vacant space above the power line and towards the road. So more or less sort of perpendicular to the road direction, out over the power line. And that's common. Trees are seeking light, so their leaves can maximise photosynthesis, and they will tend to grow out towards vacant light or vacant space where there's access to light, and they'll grow away from shaded areas. So it would be to be expected that where a tree such as the subject tree here has got a lot of vacant airspace to the north of it, that you would expect branches to grow out to take advantage of that open airspace to get access to sunlight.
Did this growth direction for branch 1 mean that it was exposed to the prevailing winds on the 26th of the 10th, 2019?
Yes, that's
We
correct.
understand to be the west-northwest winds.
Yes, that's correct.
And is it your opinion that this contributed to the branch fall?
Yes, the wind was able to funnel down the road, along the road, through the clear space there. So it wasn't impeded by moving through a forest canopy. And those branches extending out into that space were exposed to that wind effect coming along the road there. The road is more or less fairly closely aligned with the wind direction.
As well as the effect of the prevailing wind, you've told Her Honour this morning that you considered the possibility that one or other of the branches were diseased or weakened by pests. And I think, have I got this right? I'll withdraw that. Which of the branches on your review had the evidence of pest or termite damage?
Branch 1 was indicating evidence of termite damage within the branch itself.
So as well as experiencing the effect of the prevailing winds, branch 1 had some weakening as a result of termite damage. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Is that a conclusion you've drawn largely from the photographs of branch 1?
Only from the photographs of branch 1.
You refer in your report to some internal hollowing and also ribbing along the wood grain consistent with termite damage. Did you observe anything similar in relation to branch 2?
No.
You say in your report that even though branch 1 had this internal hollowing and termite damage, it would not have been obvious externally. Is that right?
That's correct.
If the termite damage had, I withdraw that. Does termite damage ever become evident externally?
It certainly can. So in some cases, if the termites have to get access to, that lower part of the branch to cause that damage, and that access can be either internally within the tree, in which case you won't be able to see. So if there is hollowing within the tree, they're able to get access to that branch within the tree, and you won't be able to see it externally. But in some cases, termites will access externally, so they create what's termed galleries. They use cellulose and mud to form a little tube that they run up the outside of the bark on the tree, which they travel up and down. And there was certainly no evidence of any termite galleries that I could see in the photographs that were available to me.
Does that mean any scoper or inspector, to use the lay term, examining the site as part of Essential Energy's vegetation management program would not have visual clues, external clues, that tree might be weakened by disease?
Yes, they would not have been able to detect from typically they make their observations from underneath the power line or close to the power line. So looking up into that tree, there would be no indicators to them that large branch was damaged within by termite activity.
I'm going to ask you some questions now, Mr. Jamar, about your review of photographs demonstrating a burnt surface on one of the branches And I'm
Yes.
going to do that by having photo 2-23 brought up on the screen, which is your figure 14. Do you recognise that as a photo that was originally taken by Mr. Hargrave, who attended the scene on behalf of Essential Energy?
Yes, I do. And
can you tell the court which of the two branches, the smaller or larger, are we looking at here?
I believe we're looking at the smaller of the two branches here.
And
Branch
could
two.
you... I'm sorry, I cut you off.
Branch 2.
Branch 2, thank you. We can see here some marks along the trunk of the branch 2. Can you explain to Her Honour what you conclude has caused those marks?
Yes, so on the branch midway up on the left-hand side, you can see a black mark, and you can see that it's got what appears to be like a zigzag edge on both sides. That, in my opinion, is not a natural marking that you would find on a eucalyptus branch such as this one. That has been caused by electrical contact with the branch, causing surface resins and surface bark cells there to become charred, which is what is causing the black colour. And the striation pattern, with the zigzag edges, indicates that the branch has moved whilst in contact with in this case, a conductor that is providing the electrical contact with the branch, which is what's causing that zigzag pattern. So that branch hasn't been resting absolutely stationary or still at all times on that conductor. It has moved, and the evidence of that is this striated pattern with the zigzag edges. But that is not a natural mark that you would expect to find on a tree branch. That's been caused by electrical contact.
Do you have an opinion as to what might have caused the smaller branch to move on the conductors and leave that type of pattern?
It's very difficult to say, but when a branch is suspended above the ground, gravity is going to move that branch. You've got the wind that is still acting on the branches while they're on the wires. So both of those factors, the wind and gravity, I wouldn't expect a branch like that to just remain absolutely stationary when we've got 30 to 40 kilometre an hour winds with stronger gusts, and a second branch which is also being acted on by the wind and is unstable on those conductors. I believe that dynamic environment is what has allowed this branch to move whilst in contact with the conductor.
And yet there was no evidence of similar charring of surface resins on the large branch, to your knowledge. Is that fair to say?
To my knowledge, I only had the photos that were available to me. There may have been other evidence of charring, but none of the photos that were available to me captured any of that. This was the only photograph within the photos that I had that demonstrated evidence of this electrical contact.
Therefore, you cannot exclude the possibility that there was similar marking to the large branch, but just not photographed.
That's correct.
What about the possibility, Mr. Demar, that the smaller branch fell first, triggered the protection devices on the electrical network, so that by the time the larger branch fell onto the conductors, they were no longer energised, and there are no markings left for that reason. Is it a possibility?
It's a possibility.
But it stands in contrast to your theory that it was actually the bigger branch that broke first and collected the smaller branch as it fell.
That's right.
I'm going to ask you some questions now just based on the trimming clearances that Essential Energy were trimming to at the scene. Can I ask you firstly to come to the table that you've included at page 2-26 of the brief? It's your table 2 and it's going to come up on screen. Your Honour, this is my fault. I might not have told the team assisting me that I was going to ask for this to come up on screen, so the delay is mine. Here we are, Mr. Demar. You've helpfully highlighted in yellow the way in which you say the subject tree fell to be determined under the minimum vegetation clearance table. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Could you just talk Her Honour through that each step in that process?
Okay. Your Honour, the first thing we look at is the voltage of the line, which is in the first column there, and this particular power line was an 11 kV power line. So we select the row that has 11 to 22 kV. The second attribute we need to take into account is that this was a bare conductor type. It wasn't an insulated or a different type of conductor. So we select the bare conductor column. These were not steel. And then, having selected those two things, we need to consider which portion of the span we were in. So the span is divided into sixths, and the first and the last six of the span, because they're close to a pole, require a lesser clearance than the middle 2/3 of the span. And so we were in the middle 2/3 of the span, so we select that row. And then over on the right-hand side, we need to select the span length. So in this case, the span length was approximately 111 metres. So that puts it in the greater than 100 but less than 200 category. And that allows us to determine a base length of 3.5 metres. And then up the top, you'll see I've highlighted in yellow that because we were in a bushfire prone area, we need to add 0.5 metres to that distance. So the 3.5 plus the 0.5 metre allowance for being in the bushfire prone area gives us a minimum clearance of 4 metres.
So does that mean there needed to be a minimum of at least 4 metres between any vegetation and the conductors at that portion of the span on Falford Road?
Correct.
Did you calculate that even when the branches were in situ, they were more than 4 metres clear of the conductors?
Yes.
Therefore, the branches did not require remedial attention under this policy because they were not intruding into the clearance space. Is that right?
That's right.
And was this the case even though you concluded that the branches would have extended out and over the conductors, although at a height greater than 4 metres above the conductors?
Yes, there is a a separate criteria for determining whether overhanging branches need to be cleared or not, whether they are infringing the minimum clearance space or not. And I've indicated in my report the concept of the clear to sky provisions, and the attribute that would cause these overhanging branches to be considered to be within the minimum clearance space would be if the span was in what was called what's termed a high risk zone as determined by essential energy. And if it's not in a high risk zone, which I understand is the case for this particular tree and span, then the clear to sky provisions would not apply.
All right, we'll come to that in a moment. Can I firstly have the photograph at page 2-31 of the brief brought up? Mr. Demar, this is your figure 19.
Yes.
Is this a photograph that you took on the day of your inspection of the scene earlier this year?
Yes, it is.
Perspective can be difficult to judge from the photographs, but what did you observe at the site to allow you to draw the conclusion that there were branches there that were overhanging the conductors earlier this year?
Yes, you're right that perspective can be difficult to convey in photographs. So what I attempted to do to assist the court with this photograph is to stand directly underneath the outer conductor, the one closest to the road, and look along the span, but upwards, and take a photograph that showed, the branch reach in relation to the location of the conductors. And that was to minimise any sort of parallax error or anything like that. And it was very clear to me that branches in the subject tree were substantially overhanging the power lines, and to try and convey that for the court, that's why I stood underneath the power line and took the photo in this direction to try and depict what I could obviously see at the site for you.
If a clear to sky vegetation clearance applied to the subject tree as at the time of this photograph, what would have needed to be done to make it compliant with that clearance?
Any branches that overhung the minimum clearance space, so this is 4 metres from the conductors, would need to be removed or trimmed back until any remaining parts of the branches were clear of that 4 metre minimum clearance space.
Is it your understanding that under the essential energy vegetation management requirements in place at the time of the fire, a clear to sky clearance had not been mandated at Falford Road?
At Falford Road, yes.
And as you say, this is because Falford Road did not fall within the essential energy classification of being a high-risk rural area. Is that right?
Yes, and also because of the voltage of the lines. So for 33 kV, for example, and 66 kV lines, even those lines, even if they're in low or medium risk areas, they still have to be cleared to the sky. So it was the combination of two things, the fact that these were 11 kV lines and the fact that they were in an area that Essential Energy had determined to be other than a high risk area. So I think their determination was that this was a moderate risk area.
One of the things you've had regard to in your report is a map produced by Essential Energy, which informs or which displays their classification of modelled bushfire risk severity zones across the state of New South Wales. Is that right?
Yes, it's a very coarse scale map that's in their bushfire mitigation plan.
And you say in your report that ideally it would be useful to have access to a map or to other information that helps the court better understand where boundaries exist between P1, P2, P3 zones. Is that right?
Yes, because the map is a map of the whole state, it's very difficult to locate where the boundaries between moderate risk and high risk areas are from a map of that sort of scale. And so information that was at a much more suitable scale for locating where those boundaries are would be helpful.
Now, you understand, don't you, Mr. Demar, that the hearing this week will not be attempting to resolve issues beyond the cause and origin of the Falford Road Darrawank fire?
Yes, I do.
And to the extent that you raise certain issues in terms of Essential Energy's classification of risk severity, bushfire risk severity, you understand, don't you, that you will likely be invited to provide a further expert opinion once Essential Energy have had an opportunity to respond to the matters that you've raised?
Yes, my understanding is we're not dealing with those issues today.
And it's likely that you will need to attend court to give evidence on a later occasion when the court considers these matters in further detail. Do you understand that?
I understand that.
Your Honour, those are my questions for Mr. Demar on that limited topic.
Thank you. Mr. Demar, I'm just going to see if there's any other questions for you, if you wouldn't mind waiting.
Thank you, Your Honour.
Ms. Ransom?
No further questions, Your Honour.
Thank you. Ms. Wilkinson?
No questions, Your Honour. Thank you.
Ms. Woodland?
No questions, Your Honour.
Thanks very much, Mr. Demar. You're excused.
Your Honour, the next witness is Mr. Glenn Hargrave.
Mr. Hargrave, can you see and hear us in the courtroom?
Yes, I can.
All right, you'll just hear from the court officer now. Thanks.
Silence, please. Do you swear by Almighty God that the evidence you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please say, I do.
I do.
Thank you. Yes, Ms. Ward.
Thank you, Your Honour. Would you state your full name and professional address?
My full name is Glenn Warren Hargrave. My professional address is 244 Union Street, South Lismore.
Thank you, Mr. Hargrave. I'll just see. Yes, we can't see you on the screen, Mr. Hargrave. Are you able to turn your camera on?
Apologies for that.
That's okay. Your Honour, Mr. Hargrave has had to make some unexpected arrangements to give his evidence this morning because the Essential Energy depot where he was hoping to give his evidence from is or has been decimated by the floods.
Yes, I can imagine it must be an extremely difficult time for you at the moment, Mr. Hargrave, up there.
Yes, Your Honour. It's been a tumultuous couple of weeks, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I can imagine, and we really appreciate you still making yourself available today.
Mr. Hargrave, what's your present position with Essential Energy?
My current position is Senior Program Supervisor, Vegetation Operations for the Northeastern region.
Did you hold that position as at the date of your attendance at the site of the Falford Road Darrawank bushfire?
The position was essentially the same. However, at the time of the fire, my title was Senior Program Supervisor, Veg Operations North Coast. My region has been extended to include the tablelands in that North Coast area or northern New South Wales area as of July last year. So at the point of the incident, I was the Senior Program Supervisor for Veg for the coastal strip.
You hold, don't you, a number of certificate qualifications in horticulture and arboriculture?
That's correct.
And you've provided 2 statements to assist the court relevant to the cause and origin of the Falford Road Darrawank fire. Is that right?
Correct.
Your first statement is dated the 20th of December 21. Do you agree?
Yes, that's correct.
And the second statement of 10 February 2022.
Correct.
One of the things you do in the second statement is to amend some of the evidence provided in your earlier statement as to the length of span between the 2 poles at Falford Road. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do.
Other than that amendment, are there any other changes you wish to make to either of your statements?
No.
Since you provided your statements to the court has received an expert report from Mr. Paul DeMar. Have you had an opportunity to read his report?
Yes, I have. Yep.
I'm going to ask you some questions today going to Mr. DeMar's theory as to branch fall and fire at Falford Road. The questions that Mr. DeMar describes, or the issues that Mr. DeMar describes within his report as being a misalignment in risk assessments between bushfire risk severity with essential energy versus assessments under the Bushfire Risk Management Plan, will await further hearing at a stage 2 hearing later in the year. Do you understand that?
Yes, that's fine.
Now, in terms of your investigation, Mr. Hargrave, did you attend Falford Road on the 28th of October 2019?
Yes, that's correct.
Was that to investigate the cause of the fire on behalf of Essential Energy?
Yes.
Had you attended some other fire scenes in the area on that day?
No, not in that specific area.
Had you attended any other fire scenes on that day?
No.
Thank you. Your attendance at Falford Road took place 2 days after fire ignition, is that correct?
Yes, I believe so.
And amongst other things, you took a series of photographs and completed something called a vegetation contact report form. Is that
Correct.
right?
Yes, correct.
Presumably your attendance at Falford Road came after an Essential Energy field crew had already been out and reconnected power at the site. Is that
Yes.
right?
Yes, that is correct. I don't believe that there was any reconnection as such. I don't believe that the conductors were actually broken. So it was a removal of the branch from the conductor and then
Yes.
resupply.
And if you, well, tell me if you can answer this or not. Does that mean that the conductors that had been brought down towards the ground by the branch or branches were able to continue in place once they were reinstalled?
To the best of my understanding, that's correct. Once the weight of the branch was lifted off them, those conductors were back in situ in a very similar condition to what they were prior to the incident.
Thank you. Now, you say in your statement that there was no police or RFS present and the scene wasn't cordoned off when you went out to the site 2 days after the fire. Is that right?
That's correct.
That means, doesn't it, that we can't be sure whether anyone might have been to the scene and moved things around or moved the location of branches and the like prior to your attendance?
That's correct.
And indeed, one of the branch that you describe as being the subject branch had already been cut, hadn't it, by the time of your attendance?
Yes, at the time of my attendance, there appeared to have been several cuts made in the branch, and there was mechanical sort of, I suppose, vehicle marks where some of the vegetation had been pushed off the road with what looked like a front end loader or some sort of machinery.
Quite possibly in response to the fire emergency, would you agree?
Yes, correct.
And the cuts to the subject branch could well have been cuts performed by the Essential Energy field crew, removing the branch from the wire.
Yes, that
that
would be
possible?
possible. Yes.
I'm going to ask you some questions now based upon a photograph that's going to come up on the screen taken from Mr. Demar's report, and it's from page 2-16 of the brief. It should come up on screen, Mr. Hargrave, but by all means, you can turn it up as well in hard copy if you have it there. Okay, can you see that on screen?
Yes, I can.
This is a photograph taken by police on the day of ignition and later marked up with the red arrows by Mr. Demar. Do you recall seeing that in his report?
Yes, I do.
Mr. Demar ultimately concludes that 2 branches fractured and fell from the subject tree onto the conductors. Do you agree that it's possible that there were, in fact, 2 separate branches involved?
Yes, I do agree that it's possible. Yes.
And having read Mr. Demar's report, would you go so far as to say it's likely that 2 separate branches fell?
Given the indication of the second stub and its location in regards to stub number 1, which refers to branch number 1, yes, I believe that could be likely.
Thank you. I'm now going to have some photos of the branch stubs brought up on screen. The first is taken from page 2-10 of the brief. Do you recognise that, Mr. Hargrave, as one of the photographs from the Demar report, which he has again marked with the red arrows?
Yes, I do.
And do you agree with his hypotheses identifying those 2 likely sites for fractured branch stubs?
Yes, I do.
You yourself took a photograph at the scene of what you considered to be the torn branch stub on the subject tree, didn't you?
Yes, that's correct.
I'll just have that photograph brought up on screen. It's from page 21-116 of the brief. Now, the resolution is not perfect on the screen, Mr. Hargrave, but do you identify within this photograph one of the branch stubs that Mr. Demar suggests one of the fallen branches came from?
Yes, I do. That would be stub number 1.
And is it to the top of the screen in between the V shape formed by the 2 top branches?
That's correct.
Okay, so we've just zoomed in on it now, and I might just have the cursor circle that small spot in between the 2 Vs and around. Thanks, Tanith. Down, thank you. All right. Mr. Hargrave, does that highlight what you had identified at the time of your inspection as the torn branch stub on the subject tree?
Yes, that's correct.
And as you say, that seems to coincide with the branch stub that Mr. Demar identifies as branch stub 1.
That's correct.
That's largely corroborated, isn't it, by your measurements taken on the day, where you say that the height of the failure point was RF 14 metres. And I'm reading this from your report at page 21-121 of the brief, annexure GH4.
Yes.
What does RF mean? You've given height of failure point RF 14 metres.
I can't recall, to be honest, what that acronym means. Sorry.
Now, the photo that you took on the day of your investigation doesn't seem to go far up enough into the tree to actually highlight what Mr. Demar has identified as a second stub point. Is that right?
That is correct. At the time of my inspection, being that the branches were cut and I didn't have visibility of the photo showing the branch on the line, it wasn't, I guess, apparent to me that there could have been a second failure point or that there was a second branch involved, given that the vegetation was just piled up in the ground.
I'm now going to have another photo brought up on screen. This is taken from the Demar report at page 2-20. Can you see that well enough, Mr. Hargrave?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Now, this is a photo taken from Google, or an image taken from Google Street View, apparently recorded in May of 2018, which Mr. Demar has marked to show the two branches that he believes fell. Now, do you agree or disagree with his conclusion that the branches marked in yellow and black and then one in white and black are the branches that likely fell onto the conductors immediately prior to the fire?
Yes, in reference to figure 11, I do believe that they are the most likely branches located in that tree at that time.
Okay. I'm just going to read now from the Demar report and his hypotheses as how the branches may have interacted as they fell, and just give you an opportunity to tell the court whether you have a view one way or the other as to his hypotheses. I'm reading from page 2-15 of the brief, and it's paragraph 30 of the Demar report. He says, "It is likely that the subject branch which broke at the location where stub 1 is located fractured under wind load imparted on it by strong west-norwesterly winds prevailing at the time of failure." Mr. Hargrave, do you have an opinion as to whether or not that's a likely or unlikely hypothesis?
No, I concur that is a likely hypothesis.
Thank you. He then goes on to say it's likely that as the subject branch fell, it collided forcefully with a second branch originating at the location where stub 2 is located, causing it to fracture and fall. What's your response to that?
Yes, I concur with that it is likely or possible that that could have occurred.
Do you go so far as to say that it's likely, or do you suggest that it's possible and you wouldn't go any further?
I suggest that it's possible.
Mr. Demar then goes on to say that both branches fell onto the power line below. You would agree with that, wouldn't you?
Yes, in the event that that is what happened, yes.
Well, we know that both branches fell on the conductors below, as evident in the police photograph that you didn't have at the time of your scene investigation. Would you agree with that?
Yes, correct.
He then goes on to say that prior to falling, both branches would have extended out above the power line. Do you agree with him that it's likely that's how the branches would have extended prior to falling?
I have an issue with that particular hypothesis, and I refer probably to his figure 12 on page 221, being different or slightly different to figure 11. My opinion of the branch and location of the branch was that the branch number 1 was in a more upright position in the tree, and that in fact the annotated photo in figure 12 is not quite correct.
I'm sorry, Mr. Hargrave, we've just lost you there. So can you just come back and repeat your answer?
Apologies for that. I believe that in figure 12, detailed in Mr. Damar's report on page 221, that the actual location of branch number 1 being the overhanging branch above branch number 2 is not correctly positioned. My opinion is that branch number 1 was located more upright in the tree crown.
So if we look at the photograph at page 221 of the Damar report, do you agree that he has highlighted the correct branch where he's marked it with the yellow lines?
I'll wait for that to come up. No, I disagree with that.
Okay. So is it your evidence that the branch that detached from stub 1 was a different branch within this canopy?
That's my opinion, yes.
And if you were to be given a copy of this Google Street View image, and I'm not suggesting this would happen today, would you be able to mark the branch that you suggest is actually the branch that comes from stub 1?
Yes, I believe I would.
Okay. And it's your hypothesis that the branch that ultimately fell from stub 1 was more likely growing in a perpendicular direction?
Correct.
And do you go so far to say that you think stub 1 was not extending out over the conductors prior to its fall?
No, having not had the visibility of that branch prior to its fall, I don't necessarily believe that it wasn't overhanging as such, just not in as pronounced an overhang position as Mr. Damar indicates.
Very well, thank you. You say in your report that the subject branch appeared to project above remaining foliage. Do you recall saying that in your second statement?
Yes, I do.
Can you explain what you mean by that?
Okay, so the phrase above remaining foliage was indicating that at the time of inspection, there was foliage still remaining. That was the closest foliage to the conductors. So previously, I believe we're talking about the distance in regards to overhangs. This was the vegetation that was closest to the conductors in regards to distance and height.
So you're not suggesting that the tree that fell, I'm sorry, I'll start again. You're not suggesting that the branch that fell from stub 1 was actually the tallest of the branches within that tree prior to its failure?
No, I would say that that was one of the highest and tallest branches. The foliage that remains, as indicated in my statement, is just small vegetation that may possibly grow in the future, but would need to, potentially be remediated outside of clearance. That's it.
All right. Now, you were able to inspect the subject branch at the scene when you attended 2 days after ignition. Is that right?
Correct.
I'm going to have one of your photographs brought up on screen. It's from page 21115 of the brief. Now,
Yeah.
is this the branch that you say shows internal evidence of termite damage?
Yes, I mean, clarifying that I'm not a qualified pest inspector, so
Yeah.
I would state that this shows signs of internal borer damage that is, indicative of termite damage.
And on your review of the branch at the scene, did you see any marking to that branch consistent with arcing as it's fallen onto the conductors? Resins burning by reason of contact with the conductors?
Yes, I believe that there is another photo in Mr. Damar's report, which I took, that shows
Yes.
there was electrical discharge in contact with the branch.
We're having a bit of difficulty with the connection, Mr. Hargrave. I just wonder if there's anything that we can do to improve that. Sorry, just one moment. We'll just keep going and see how we go.
Now, I might need you to repeat that answer, but you said something about a photograph that you took that somehow relates to evidence of arcing or resins burning in the subject branch that fell. Could you just repeat that answer?
Yes, that's correct. In reference to your previous question, I believe there is a
Yep.
photo that shows markings on the branch that are consistent with electrical discharge and contact with live conductors.
All right.
I think we're having the same problem. I'd have to go audio.
We might be able to go audio, Your Honour. I think Mr. Hargrave has hard copies of his statements in Mr. Damar's report. So long as we identify the pages that we're looking at by reference to the brief numbers, he should be able to see what we're looking at and we should be able to follow his evidence. So if Your Honour's content, I'll ask you to briefly adjourn and we'll just have Mr. Hargrave hold on line and then we will work out bringing my telephone.
All right. If you wouldn't mind just waiting a moment, Mr. Hargrave, I'm just going to adjourn very briefly. Just sort of a technical issue.
Apologies, Your Honour. Thank you.
Yes, Ms Warden, thank you for your patience, Mr Hargrave.
No problem, Your Honour. Thank you.
Mr. Hargrave, I'm just going to take you back a little way, and I'm going to have some photos brought up on the screen again. Firstly, this is page 2-21 from the DeMar report, and we'll just wait for it to come up. All right, do you recall giving some evidence about the branch which he identifies as branch 1, and you've suggested that branch 1 was instead more perpendicular?
Yes, I do recall. Yep.
Do you see there that Mr. DeMar has highlighted in black and white a branch which he identifies as branch 2? And
Yes, I do.
do you agree with that as the likely branch 2 that detached from stub 2 within the tree?
Yes, no dispute in regards to stub 2.
Okay. And then I was asking you some questions in relation to the branches that had fallen to the ground, dealing with the termite damage and any arcing damage. I'm going to have photograph 21.18 come up on the screen, which should be one of your photographs, Mr. Hargrave. Okay. Do you recognise that as a photo that you took during your site inspection?
Yes, I do.
And do you agree with Mr. DeMar that this demonstrates some charring to the left-hand side of the branches displayed?
Yes, I do.
I'm now, firstly, while I've got that on the screen, do you recall whether you saw any evidence of termite or other damage in that branch, the branch that had that char mark?
No, the internal structure of that branch was distinctly different to the stub as identified previously.
And distinctly different, does that extend to having no evidence, internal evidence of suggesting termite or other pest damage?
Correct. The integrity of the wood in the internal structure of that appeared sound.
And accepting that you're not giving evidence in your capacity, you're not suggesting that you're a pest inspector, but on the basis of your qualifications in horticulture and your role with vegetation management within Essential Energy, there was nothing internal to that branch suggesting it had been weakened by pests.
No visible signs of pest activity in that branch.
Very well. Now we'll come back to one of your photos at page 21-115. Okay, do you recognise that photo, Mr. Hargrave?
Yes, I do.
Does this show a different branch to the branch that was displayed in the previous photo?
It was difficult for me to ascertain that, as the vegetation was obviously cut and sort of piled up at the time. So, but it is different in regards to obviously the evidence of termites or borer pest activity inside this branch.
Because this branch had evidence consistent with it being weakened as a result of pest damage. Is that right?
Correct, yes.
And then what about any evidence on this branch as to any possible arcing or damage caused by contact with the conductors? Do you recall seeing anything of that type?
Not on this particular branch. This branch was the stub, or this end was the large stub of the branch, and I didn't notice any particular blackening or sort of burn marks indicative of contact with wires on this particular branch here. That being said, it was in pieces, so it was difficult to ascertain. There was definitely obvious contact with, in regards to the other photo, but as to say there were two branches was difficult for me at that time.
What about now, as of your evidence today? Do you think it's likely that what we're looking at in your photo 21118 versus 21115 are two different branches?
Yes, having reviewed Mr. Demar's report and looking at the tree, I do concur that's likely.
Just then, coming back to this issue of branches that show evidence consistent with burning or contact with the conductors, we've got the photo that you took at 21118. And sorry, I'll just have that brought back up on the screen again, please, Tanner. Could I have 21118, please? This will come up shortly, Mr. Hargrave. Now, within your report, or within the photos that you took at the scene that you've provided to the court, we have this shot and we have a close-up of this shot. But was there otherwise another branch or part of a branch that showed separate patterns similar to this, suggesting charring as a result of contact with the conductors?
The only evidence I saw at the time of something similar was located on the very tip of one of the branches and seemed to be a consistent line of blackening across one section of smaller foliage. So where you can see in this photo, the foliage is actually being dried by the resultant heat. At the time of the fire, this was caught up in the electrical mains, so it was above the ground. So not a lot of the leaves were burnt off this. I do recall seeing a small piece of smaller sort of end tip foliage that you would see like underneath that particular branch there. And it was blackened with no leaves attached to the end of the stump, which would indicate there was some level of fire there.
And did you take a photo of that observation?
I believe I do have a photo of that, yes.
We know that you haven't produced to the court all of the photos that you took on the day, but are you able at some later point to review those photos and see if there is a photo of that type?
Yes, that would be possible.
Thank you. Your Honour, those are my questions for Mr. Hargrave.
Miss Ward, I do have, sorry, Your Honour, I just would like to clarify one statement. Earlier on, when we first began, one of the questions was in relation to what did RF mean in regards to the height. Apologies that I had a little brain block there. That was in reference to a height, like the measurement being taken with a range finder.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. If you wouldn't mind just waiting a moment, Mr. Hargrave, while I see if there's any questions from anyone else. Ms. Woodland?
No questions, Your Honour.
Ms. Ransom?
No questions, Your Honour.
Ms. Wilkinson?
Your Honour, just one question, if I may. Is it possible to bring up photograph 21117?
It should be possible, but it might just
take a moment. Yes. 21117.
Thank you. Mr. Hargrave, you said that when you arrived on the scene that the branches were stacked up. Is this your photo of what it looked like when you got there?
Correct, yes. This is a photo I took, yes.
And the branches are sort of stacked up, as you can see there?
Yes, and you can see in the background there behind the fence, there's a log off in the distance with some whiter, lighter soil that's not soot blackened. that's where it was evident that there was tyre tracks and front end loader or some kind of mechanical, it had pushed that log into the paddock.
And I think if on the right-hand side of the photograph there, at what looks like the base of those two branches, is it fair to say that looks like it's been cut, as you were describing earlier?
That is correct, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Your Honour. I have no other questions.
Thank you. Anything arising?
No, thank you, Your Honour.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hargrave. You're excused.
Thank you, Your Honour. Thank you, everyone.
All the best. Yes, Mr. Castleton.
Your Honour, if it's convenient, could Professor Blackburn please be called?
Yes. Professor Blackburn, are you able to see and hear us in the courtroom? Professor Blackburn, are you able to see and hear us?
I am here, yes, and I can start. We'll just tidy things up a moment, I'll be with you. Okay, I'm ready.
We might just have to get you to put your microphone down a little bit towards your mouth. Is that possible? Could you just speak again, Professor Blackburn?
I'm sorry, what was the problem?
That's better. Yeah, that's it. You're just hear from the court officer now.
Thank you.
Silence, please. Do you solemnly and sincerely declare and affirm that the evidence you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please say, I do.
I do.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Castleton.
Professor, would you please state your full name?
Trevor Robert Blackburn.
And are you a consulting electrical engineer and adjunct associate professor with the School of Electrical Engineering at the University of New South Wales?
Yes, I am.
And do you hold a Bachelor of Science degree with honours in physics and mathematical physics?
Yes.
Do you also have a PhD from Flinders University?
Yes, I do, yeah.
And what was your doctoral thesis on?
Doctor thesis was on ionising shockwaves in plasmas, in
And do you-
electrical discharges.
Thank you, Professor. And do you have a particular interest and expertise in electrical power supply systems and the investigation of electrically caused bushfires?
Yes, I do. I've had very considerable experience and worked in that field for many years.
Could you just outline briefly some of that experience that you have in relation to those two matters, that is electrical power supply systems and investigating electrically caused bushfire?
I have been involved in the Ash Wednesday bushfires in Adelaide, also one of the Ash Wednesday bushfires in Victoria, in the Victorian bushfires of some years ago, and after that I was appeared as a witness in the Royal Commission into those bushfires. I've been involved in the Black Saturday bushfires and in various other bushfires around Australia, including Western Australia and Northern Territory, as well as Queensland, New South Wales, South Australia and Victoria.
Thank you. Were you briefed by the Department of Communities and Justice to provide an expert opinion in relation to the likely cause of an ignition at Falford Road, Darrawank, here in New South Wales?
Yes, I was.
And as part of your brief, did you undertake a site visit at Falford Road, Darrawank, or not?
I did not visit the site in Darrawank.
Have you provided to those assisting Her Honour an expert report dated the 6th of March 2022?
Yes, I have, yes.
And do you have a copy of your report with you this afternoon, Professor?
Yes, I do.
Do you adhere to the opinions you've expressed throughout today in that report of 6 March 2022?
Yes, I do. I still hold all of the opinions that I put in that report.
I'll just have displayed on the screen page 2139 of the brief of evidence, which is photo 1, Professor, of your report, appearing at page 3 of your report. Could you just describe, for Honour's benefit, the electrical infrastructure that was present at that part of Falford Road in Darrawank where a branch or branches may have come down from a particular eucalyptus tree onto power lines?
Yes, yes, that was the particular span of a high voltage 11,000 volt 3-phase line with phase A, B and C given there between 2 poles, one of which on the very left in the foreground is 3,483 and the other one in the distance is pole 1283. And so they supported those 3 lines. The voltage of the lines between each of those 3 lines, there is 11,000 volts, and between any one of those lines and earth, there is 6,350 volts. And so in this particular fault, a branch of a eucalypt tree fell onto the 2, the left hand, which are the southern side, the 2 southern side conductors, and interacted with those 2 conductors, but the branch did not interact with the roadside, the northern of those 3 conductors.
Thank you, Professor. Now, as one looks at that photograph and can see quite clearly the roadside and a fence line,
Yes.
if one was to move from the fence line towards the road, which is phase A, B and C?
Phase A is the left hand. Phase A is the middle conductor. Phase C is the left-hand conductor, and phase B is the right-hand roadside conductor.
Thank you. And I'll just have displayed photograph 3 on page 2142, which was a photograph taken by New South Wales Police shortly after the fire commenced. I'll just go back a page, thank you. And the power line that is unimpeded is phase B. Do I understand?
Yes, phase A and phase C are interacting with the fallen branch, but phase B, the conductor on the roadside, is not interacting with the branch or the vegetation from the branch in any way.
And in relation to this particular feeder system, what electrical power supply systems were present, particularly in relation to automatic recloser systems and the like?
That line was designated 3B2, and it originated from a zone substation at Harrington Point, and at Harrington Point there would have been a transformer that broke the voltage down to 11,000 volts to supply this particular feeder line, and at that point where it fed the feeder line, there would be electrical protection to respond and react to any faults that occurred in the feeder line, and also that protection also included it was an automatic recloser device, and that protection was incorporated in the recloser device. Also incorporated in the recloser device was a circuit breaker, and so in the event that the protection detected a fault that was within the sensitivity of the fault detection levels for that feeder, if it detected a fault there, then it would send a trip signal to the circuit breaker to isolate power from the line. But as most of these feeders, rural feeders are, most of the faults that occur on them, about 80% of the faults that occur on rural feeder lines of this type are transient faults, and they cure themselves in general quite quickly. And so the recloser is there just to provide automatic reclosing of the circuit breaker after a period of time to allow the fault to clear itself, usually 5 to 10 seconds, and then the circuit breaker will be reclosed by the protection system. And if there is still a fault there, then it will open, and then it will reclose again after another, in this case, 10 seconds of dead time, and then it can do that for as many times as it's programmed, usually 3 to 4 times. And so in this case, it operated 3 times, and then it locked out. And when the circuit breaker locked out, it then required, essentially manual reclosing, but it is assumed in that situation that the fault is permanent, and so some investigation is needed of the fault before the circuit can be restored.
I'll return to that shortly, but in terms of the fault protection systems that Essential Energy had as at October of 2019, did it detect 3 different types of electrical fault?
Yes, it has the protection system of the recloser. Normally has, in this case, it certainly had 3 different types of faults that were able to be detected. One was the most simple type of fault, which is a phase-to-phase fault, where there is a short circuit or some short between any 2 of those 3 lines, or perhaps even all 3 of those 3 lines. And in that case, you will normally get a quite high current fault occurring, so it's called the overcurrent fault detection method. And so in that case, it can be a fault where the current is greater than the normal operating current that passes through those lines in normal operation. And so in this case, typically that current would have been, just looking at some of the protection records, I just estimated that the normal current would be about 150 amps. And so anything usually about the trip level of the overcurrent setting is normally about 20% above that maximum operational level. And so in this case, I estimated that it would have been about 180 amps would have been required to trip the overcurrent phase-to-phase fault setting of the protection system. But
pausing
then,
pausing there, Professor. The other 2 electrical faults that this protection system detects earth faults, that is, phase to earth?
That's correct. Yeah, there are in fact two different settings that are standard used in the standard protection system for this type of line. One is the earth fault setting, just called the EF setting, and that occurs whenever an earth fault current is detected. And that may be an earth fault current where one of the three lines is somehow connected to the electrical earth, which in this case will be the ground, the soil, or that fence that the branch fell onto, and then current will flow from one of those phase conductors down to earth. Because of the high impedance of this type of fault, these are not normally overcurrent faults. The current is almost always somewhat lower than the normal operating current in the line. And so the earth fault protection has to detect much lower currents and trip as a result of that. And so in this case, it would be a lower current than, say, 180 amps. But typically with a high impedance, the high electrical impedance of the earth path, say, down through the main branch of the tree to earth, it would have been a very high impedance, so currents would have been quite low. And I estimated, I think, about 1.83 amps using some data that was in a handbook that I got from an American research organization. And so that is the earth fault. In the earth fault, you can still get reclosing occurring of the circuit breakers with the earth fault. And so it may trip once and then it will reclose and then trip again if the fault is still there. But then in addition to that, there is what's called a sensitive earth fault setting for the circuit breaker. That's the SEF setting. And this is for what are called high impedance arcing faults, where the fault itself has a very high electrical impedance, which limits the fault current to very low magnitudes, but nevertheless it is still a fault current. It still generates heat and it is still capable of igniting vegetation and similar material. Now in the SEF type setting, the trip level there is much lower than it is in the earth fault setting. In the earth fault setting, the trip level will probably be about 40 or 50 amps. But in the SEF fault level, it will be down at about typically 5 amps will trip that. And because when it goes into that mode of operation with very low fault currents, because it's unlikely in that situation that the fault is going to be a temporary one that will cure itself shortly. In the SEF mode of operation, the recloser function is disabled. And so when it operates in SEF mode, there is only one trip and then the circuit breaker will lock out.
Professor, you said earlier that there were 3 trips in relation to this particular protection system, that's so?
That's correct, yes.
And from your review of the records produced by Essential Energy, did you form the opinion that this was likely a phase-to-phase and 3-phase overcurrent fault?
Yes, in they provided, the Essential Energy provided protection records which gave the currents in each of the 3-phase conductors for each of those 3 trips. And in the A and C phase, the currents were very high, and the other aspect of interest there was that the currents in A and C phase for each of the three phases were identical. And so that meant that the three trips were a phase-to-phase fault between phase A and phase C. And the other phase, phase B, had a much lower current in there, I think 100 amps the first time, and then up to about 150 amps the second and third time. And so those currents are probably the normal operational current of that particular phase, and probably of the other two phases when they are not faulted.
And in terms of the mechanism to cause that phase-to-phase fault or trip, what did you conclude as the likely mechanism? Was it phase-to-phase, that is the clashing of two conductors, or was there another mechanism, in your opinion, that was most likely to cause that trip?
If there was a clashing of the conductors, these conductors are normally, as was seen in those photographs, they're normally set to about 0.2, 0.3 or even 0.4 meters apart. And so if they did clash together and emit molten particles in the normal mode of clashing emission of molten particles that can fall to the ground and ignite vegetation, if they had done that, then you would have had metal-to-metal contact. There would have been very substantial arc fusion damage to the conductors at those points of contact. And so but there were no reports of that from Essential Energy, from the workers who who restored the line by taking the branches off. There were no reports of any damage by way of arc fusion on the conductors. And so in my mind, that I ruled out the possibility of clashing conductors, and so just looked at the most likely probable cause was just simply bridging between A and C phases by some...
Pausing there, Professor. Pausing there. Sorry to interrupt. When you refer to bridging between phases A and C, are you referring to foliage or vegetation acting as a bridge between each of those two phases?
That's correct, yes. I'm within using bridging, I'm meaning a bridge of some green cellulose based material, such as wood, small twigs, small branches, or leafy sections. So it was a bridge between the two phases made of green vegetation from the tree branch.
And in terms of the mechanism of ignition, how would that bridging between phase A and C lead to an ignition of that vegetation or foliage, as you've just described?
When the wood is not a very good electrical conductor, and particularly dry wood with no moisture in it is quite a good insulator. But green wood, such as you had at the end of the branch there, which has lots of moisture in it, by virtue of most of that moisture, the wood becomes a semiconductor. It's not a conductor in the same sense that metal is a good conductor, but nevertheless, it will conduct electric current, mainly because of the moisture that's just under the bark layer there, and that will allow a small current flow between phase A and phase C through the green tree vegetation, wood or leaves or the like, and that will have a small current in the material that I used from the American source would have indicated that it was going to give a current of around about 1 or 2 amps. And then that would burn for a reasonably long time. It would be more or less not quite a permanent fault, but it would allow current to flow for a long time. And then when the current does flow through the wood, it evaporates the moisture evaporates and gives you the crackling sound that the witness who saw all of this happening heard. And then it allows current to flow through the wood. It starts to carbonize the wood, char the wood, and so you can then start to get embers formed. And eventually you will get more or less a charcoal bridge replacing the green wood between the two, and charcoal is a much better conductor of electricity than is green wood. And so once the charcoal forms between the two conductors, then the current level will start to rise fairly rapidly, and eventually it will allow an arc to be developed along the surface of the wood between phase A and phase B. But the current of that arc will be much lower than you get when you have a clashing contact of the two metals. And also the arc roots at the metal will move about a bit, and so it won't, that sort of arc along the wood with moving points of contact on the metal of the conductors won't give you any indication of gross fusion, arc fusion damage to the conductors, but it will cause, until that arc is formed, it can cause burning embers. It can and then they can drop to the ground and can ignite the vegetation on the ground, dry grass on the ground, and then all of that can happen before the current in the fault between the two conductors across that wooden bridge. It will cause ignition potentially, well, certainly in this case, before the current is high enough to cause the electrical protection to pick up.
The electrical protection, Professor, the electrical protection system record the first trip in respect of phase A and C at 2,800 amps. Yeah. Are you able to say in time how long the mechanism or the process you've just described would take to reach that level to cause the system to trip?
It's very difficult to put any particular time on it, but certainly from experimental work that we've done in our laboratory at University of New South Wales and in other images and videos that I've seen of high voltage current passage through wood, it would typically take tens of seconds, and in some cases, if the current is somewhat lower, even up to minutes, and so it will be, in my estimate, in this case, tens of seconds, potentially up to a minute or more.
And do I understand your expert opinion that the ignition in respect of this fire was caused in those early stages, perhaps up to a minute or thereabouts, when the first trip occurred?
Yes, yes. I during that minute, as I say, you would have got embers forming due to the heat of that current through the wood, and those embers can then fall to the ground and cause ignition. But at the same time, the embers can leave a charcoal layer along the wood between the two phases, and that charcoal wood will then start to allow the fault current between the two to escalate until eventually you effectively form an arc between the two conductors. An arc maybe 0.3, even 0.4 meters long by the time you take account of the thermal uprising that you get with the arc. And in all that time, the current won't be high enough to trip the overcurrent protection, because in this case, there is no earth that's going to excite the EF or the SEF protection system. It will only be the overcurrent protection system. So you need at least 180 amps to activate the overcurrent phase-to-phase protection. And so then the current will get up to very high levels once you get an arc formed across the surface of the wood. Then it will start to escalate to a quite high level. It will then go above the 180 amps, and then will trip the or send a signal. The protection will then send a signal to the circuit breaker to trip.
Professor, in your opinion, what, if any, realistic means are available or would be available to Essential Energy to speed up tripping of the breaker in order to prevent ignition taking place?
It's certainly possible to speed up the timing of the breaker. The protection has a current time characteristic curve, and for a particular current, you will have some specified time that it delays until it sends a signal to the trip. If you want to get it to trip more quickly, then once the current gets above the trip level, you can then set the trip to be instantaneous. As soon as that happens, then the protection will send an instantaneous signal. That will shorten the possible arcing time that you might get. But in this situation, all of the damage has been done before the electrical protection has been activated, because the current flowing through the wood is quite low. Even in the ember generation phase, the current will not be above the trip level of the circuit breaker. And so it doesn't matter whether you have an instantaneous trip of the circuit breaker or some delayed trip of the circuit breaker. All of the damage has been happening before the current in that type of fault is high enough to cause any trip.
Would a consequence of accelerating the early development of a fault be that it would provide inadequate reliability of the feeder system, firstly?
You could certainly set the protection system, the tripping levels to much lower levels. But of course, in the phase, with the phase currents being typically about 100 to 150 amps in their normal operation, you can't set the levels for phase-to-phase trip below that particular level, because then you will have the system tripping out whenever you just have normal load current there. But in the case of the earth fault and SEF, the sensitive earth fault methods, it is possible to reduce those levels down to quite low values. And so I said I calculated about 1.83 amps as the level at which you would get current flowing initially between the two conductors across the wooden branch or the wooden bridge between those two conductors. And so you could theoretically take the tripping level down to about 1 amp, and then that would pick up those low-level earth faults. But in doing that, it will increase very considerably the amount of random tripping from various events that you get that are not really necessarily faults. In some cases, when a large transformer that's supplied by the line may be switched on, its initial switch on current can be much higher than the normal load current, and so that can just trip the circuit breaker if you have it at a very low setting. And so nuisance tripping becomes a real problem as you try to set the trip current levels to a much lower value. And so it becomes an issue for the utility as to whether they want to lose reliability of supply and have many random trips, nuisance tripping. And so they've got to balance that those two issues to determine what the most effective protection means will be.
Do I take it, Professor, that you're not critical of the settings that were in existence within the essential energy protection system as at October of 2019?
Not in this particular case. I think that with the very low currents you get with the high electrical impedance of the wood between the two phases, then you get quite low currents. And to get your earth fault and your sensitive earth fault protection settings or trip settings down to low levels, that will be able to pick up that fault. It's just going to make the reliability of the system extremely poor. And there are particular requirements by the regulator that give specific guidelines as to what the reliability of the system should be. So my answer is that in this case, in this particular case, I don't have any criticisms of the settings that were used by essential energy.
Thank you, Professor. They're my questions, Your Honour.
Thank you. Ms. Ransom, do you have any questions?
No questions, Your Honour.
Ms. Woodland?
No, Your Honour.
Ms. Wilkinson?
No, Your Honour.
Thank you very much, Professor. You're excused.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Your Honour now has the benefit of the documentary material contained within the brief of evidence tendered as Exhibit 49A, as well as the oral testimony of Mr. Paul Demar, expert witness, Mr. Glenn Hargrave, Senior Program Supervisor in Vegetation Operations for the Northern Eastern Region at Essential Energy, and of course just now the expert evidence of Adjunct Associate Professor Trevor Blackburn. At a later stage in Your Honour's inquiry into the 2019-2020 bushfire season, those assisting Your Honour will formally address Your Honour on the cause and origin of the Falford Road Darrawank fire. In that regard, I can foreshadow now, for the benefit of my learned friends, that formal submissions are likely to be made that the fire commenced around 11:41 a.m. on Saturday 26 October 2019 as a result of arcing following a branch or branches falling onto 11,000 volt conductors between poles 12,480 and 34,830 on Falford Road, Darrawank. Would Your Honour kindly stand this matter over, consistent with the others, to 5 September 2022?
Yes, I do that now.
Your Honour, that concludes that inquiry. The last remaining inquiry is scheduled for tomorrow, and it relates to the Hillville fire.
Thank you, Mr Castleton. We'll adjourn until 10 a.m. tomorrow.